grid that interferes with the original wavefront, the effect of it can be easily characterized as slowed down and bent. So it's not a discrete kind of absorption and re-emission that you would get from, say, a sodium atom or a hydrogen atom or an oxygen atom, which is in quartz and glass. But it's a net effect due to interaction with the bulk material. So that's a little more nuanced and not as technical as a physicist might prefer. There's no equations in it, but it is a more accurate description of why light is refracted when it passes through water and glass and air. So we're now online. Good. Now it's time for today's talk. All right. Some of you may have seen news stories recently about dire wolves back from the dead. Right? So this is the first zombie we're going to talk about today. First ancient, perhaps living fossil, but it's probably not appropriate to consider these pups as living fossils for a few different reasons. One of which is that the company who made this, the Colossal Biotech, they started with gray wolves, and fossil evidence and evidence from DNA collected from fossil dire wolf remains in the La Brea tar pits, etc., indicate that dire wolves were more closely related to jackals than to today's wolves. But what they did was they deliberately modified some of the DNA of gray wolves to make them larger, to make them more muscular, to give them white coats and some other attributes. And those genetic modifications are similar, very similar, to the genetic attributes of an actual extinct dire wolf. So there's some wiggle room there for saying that, yes, they have a genetic profile analogous to an extinct dire wolf. One of the other reasons for skepticism is that there were some instances where the scientists wanted to ideally modify a particular gene expression for the wolf to make it more like a dire wolf, but they recognized that that gene had implications, or that segment of DNA had relevance to more than one gene, which happens in living things more frequently than we thought back in the 70s and 80s. And so they left those genes alone and modified other genes that were more isolated and less likely to have knock-on deleterious consequences for the living being. And so it was very much a scientific project and kind of an art project, you might say, rather than a literal de-extinction of an old species. So I call them genuine faux dire wolves. That's I used to see that when I was a child. I remember seeing commercials on television for genuine faux pearls, and I thought, wow, faux pearls, must be particularly rare. So for those who don't know, faux means false. It's I think Latin for false. So genuine false dire wolves is what they are, and bred or scientifically engineered. Now there is some great science in that, like the ability they use CRISPR to modify many genes at once in the germ cells or whatever cells they were manipulating to reprogram them, and that was pretty innovative, to be able to make many changes at once to a genome. So some pretty interesting science there. All right, so a living fossil, as I mentioned briefly previously, has a similar body size and shape or phenotype to an extinct fossil, to a fossil remain that we can discover in the fossil record. However, genetic drift and mutation has continued, so even though you may discover a living being that is similar to a fossilized being, the genome of today's being may be markedly different than the ancient example. So genetic drift and mutation has continued. Still, the extant, or the living being or living plant or animal that we discover today is far closer in relationship to the ancient fossilized species than subsequently derived and evolved lineages. So evolution doesn't stop, but sometimes it pauses. That's one way to think about it, right? And the fossil species are a pause, if you will. I did not identify that as the coelacanth, right? That is a coelacanth, which was believed to have been extinct until the 1970s. Yeah, when one was found. It's a lobe-finned fish. And a particular lobe-finned fish is believed to have been the ancestor of all land vertebrates. What was that called? Yeah, I'm drawing a blank on it. Tiktaalik. Thank you. Tiktaalik. All right, so about 700 million years ago, before the legendary Cambrian explosion that you may have heard of, which was about 500 million years ago, prior to that, by about 200 million years, perhaps the most primitive multicellular animal evolved, and the one that's still extant, still to be found in our world, and that's sponges. So sponges are actually a type of animal, and they are extremely primitive. There are kinds of sponges that we can find today that match almost identically with fossil sponges from hundreds of millions of years ago, long before the dinosaurs evolved, long before there was life on the surface, on the dry surface of planet Earth. So sponges are some of the most ancient living fossils, macroscopic, right? There's all kinds of archaea and bacteria that have probably been around forever, figuratively speaking. I don't really mean forever. Okay, also hexapods. So spiders typically have how many legs? 8, right? These are hexapods. They're 6-legged insects. And they are from about 420 million years ago. These are 2 different variations of things that we call springtails. It's estimated that in temperate climes like this, you can find about 100,000 springtails per meter of ground. So they live at the top of soil and maybe within an inch or so, and they feast on organic matter in the soil, typically. And springtails. So 420 million years is their legacy, and they've persisted so long without destroying themselves or being wiped out by a disease or being supplanted by other creatures, so they continue to live in their niche, which is the top surface of soils around the world. All right, another living fossil from about 450 million years ago is the horseshoe crab. No other relative of this critter is extant today. A horseshoe crab is distantly related to trilobites. You may know about trilobite fossils. Quite a distance between them, but more closely related than are insects and horseshoe crabs, for example. Right? So horseshoe crab is a very ancient creature on Earth. Another are tortoises. Pardon me. Tortoises have been around for a very long time. This is a particular famous tortoise named Jonathan. And Jonathan currently lives on St. Helena. He was transported there in about the early to mid 1800s. And he was believed to be about 50 years old when he was deposited on St. Helena. He just missed Napoleon. Those of you who are interested, you know, St. Helena is where Napoleon went to die, not voluntarily. And, well, not that any of us die voluntarily, but you know what I mean. All right, so he just barely missed cohabitating with Napoleon on the remote South Atlantic island of St. Helena. And it is estimated that Jonathan is 193 years old. So not only is he a living fossil, he's also a living antique. So. And then the platypus, from about 200 million years ago. Monotremes, there's a couple of different monotremes extant in the world today, echidnas, and duck-billed platypus. And you know that these are weird beasts, right? They've got a duck bill, and they lay eggs, and they have a venomous claw, and very strange creatures. They also detect electrical perturbations with sensory organs on their bill, analogous to the way a shark can detect electrical fields. So, very peculiar creature and an early mammal. All right, here's some more examples. I'll give you some pictures of these. I'm going to have to look at the slide to know what. So we've got club mosses. Club mosses are one of the earliest vascular plants. So in order for plants to migrate from living in oceans to living on land, they had to develop a support structure. And one of the earliest ways for them to support themselves was a kind of hydraulic force that helped keep them upright because of their vascular or veiny system. And so club mosses are also very ancient, from about 410 million years ago. Horsetails are a very ancient form of plant. During the Cretaceous, when dinosaurs were prolific, there wasn't really any grass, right? So grass is a relatively newly evolved organism, but there were things like horsetails, and some horsetails formed tree-like organisms that got to be 100 feet tall or so. So the modest horsetails we see around us today are different than the whole panoply of horsetail related organisms that lived during the time when dinosaurs were around and before. Ferns, right? Some of you have seen illustrations of dinosaurs in their natural habitat, and almost always that involved things that looked like pine or palm trees and ferns on the ground and whatnot. And ferns are also an ancient lineage going back about 360 million years. Cycads, so those palm tree-looking things you saw were probably cycads. Cycads are often mistaken for palm trees to a casual observer, and I'm pretty casual today. I probably wouldn't have known the difference. And but they're palm-like, but not at all related. Well, except that we're all related, but not closely related to palm trees and palm plants. Next, we have ginkgo trees. Ginkgo biloba, about 270 million years old. So these things were certainly around when the dinosaurs roamed the earth. And we have a ginkgo biloba tree in front of the church, right behind that wall, I think. And very ancient tree. I don't know. I believe I read that there's no other living example closely related to them. They're once again sort of a single species within their whole group. And then conifer trees are ancient. Pine trees and whatnot. They are an ancient group, and they date back about 300 million years. So dinosaurs likely had pine forests to enjoy. And then we get to what I want to focus on, especially today, is a magnolia. Magnolias are between 95 and 130 million years old, and they are considered a primitive angiosperm, which is a complicated word to mean flowering plant, right? So flowers are relatively new in the fossil record, relatively recent. But there's some overlap with dinosaurs, 95 to 130 million years old. There's some uncertainty about just how long back into prehistory magnolias stretched. And then about 130 million years old, this is considered one of, if not the most primitive sort of angiosperm. Maybe it's difficult to recognize those as flowers. They look more like fruiting bodies, but this is a Ambrolia, Ameboia, Amaborella, I believe, or Amborella. I'm not familiar with it, but it is a very primitive angiosperm. It doesn't have the kinds of structures that we would typically associate with flowers. So it's considered a descendant of a species that was sort of the base of a whole genera that arose as flowering plants. And similar to magnolias, we have water lilies. Water lilies are also considered a very ancient plant from about 125 million years ago. So interestingly enough, when you think of flowers, tulips and daffodils and black-eyed Susans and, on and on and on, think of all the flowers you plant in your gardens or the wildflowers you see out in fields, roses and whatnot. All of those species arose after the extinction of the dinosaurs. So there were no fields of flowers before the extinction of the dinosaurs. There were flowering shrubs and there were some flowering plants in the water, like the water lilies, but the kinds of flowers that we love today did not exist until the dinosaurs went away and opened up some niches for these very primitive kinds of flowers to really expand and evolve into the flowers that we see elsewhere in the world. And here's a simplified diagram showing the evolution of plants and certainly flowering plants. And we see that the pine trees and whatnot are called gymnosperms. They create large seeds or seed cones that fall. Prior to them, you've got the ferns and the horsetails and the club mosses and whatnot. These were around with the dinosaurs and predated them. And then you've got the flowering plants that evolve. You get some of the really early ones, like the magnolia. So the magnolia is considered near the base, evolutionarily speaking. If you draw the tree of evolution with species branching out, the magnolia is an early species. So the magnolia is familiar, yet in some ways strange if you look at it closely. I've had a magnolia tree in front of my house ever since I've lived there, for 21 years. And I never really looked at it closely. And that's really too bad, because there's some really interesting stuff going on with a magnolia tree and flower that I never really noticed. And that's one of the hallmarks of a good naturalist or scientist like Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin was very insightful, but one of the characteristics that Charles Darwin exhibited throughout his life was an incredible attention to detail. He was highly observant. He watched beetles, he was interested in barnacles, he was interested in worms and flowers and bees, and nearly any living thing that he could see, even literally in his own backyard. He tried to examine them carefully and understand their habits and what made one thing different from another thing and how those differences might have arisen. So it's an attribute of scientists to be observant of the natural world. Whereas most of us, myself included, can just walk by a pretty flower and say, that smells nice. Somebody else could stop and say, what makes this flower different than that flower? Why does it smell different? And I wonder how it's pollinated, right? How does it reproduce? And what animal vectors help it pollinate? So unlike many flowers where we say that the flowers have petals, we say that water lilies and magnolias have tepals rather than petals. And if you look at most other flowers, you've got this green sort of sheath that opens up and kind of protects the bud. And that green sheath is distinct from the petals. Well, in ancient angiosperms, ancient flowers, that distinction is really blurred out. It has not solidified in the genetic expression of their phenotype yet. So, so the distinction between the covering of the bud and the beautiful flowering parts of the bud that we might otherwise call petals, that distinction is blurred or lost, and so biologists have called them tepals instead of petals. So the sepal, so a typical flower has petals and sepals or sepals, and the sepals are the sort of the protective covering around a bud. But again, in primitive flowering plants, that distinction is not yet well established in the genetic expression or in the body of the flower. Magnolias evolved over 95 million years ago, so you know that the dinosaur extinction happened 65 million years ago, so this is certainly predating that. It may be that magnolias evolved even earlier than this, maybe 130 million years ago or so. The fossil record is not considered definitive on that. And it's really hard to preserve many things, especially plants, right? Bones, like bones of dinosaurs, are much more easily preserved. You know, you might get 1 in a billion bones preserved from a dinosaur, but you might get 1 in 10 or 20 billion petals or leaves preserved. So making a fossil to begin with is a very rare happenstance, and making a fossil of a soft-bodied thing like a plant is even more rare. There are some fossil beds in the world where there are lots of fossil plants. In fact, there's one in southern Illinois. There's an entire Cretaceous forest in the coal beds of southern Illinois. I remember reading an article about, I think somebody from National Geographic went down into this coal mine, and it was like literally a fossil forest. They could see the outlines of the tree trunks and the limbs and the leaves, just as patterns in the coal before it was mined. And so this is a fossil of a magnolia leaf. This is held by the Field Museum down by the lakeshore in Chicago. One of the attributes of really ancient angiosperms is that they have a spiral pattern to their leaves. If you look at your magnolia trees, you'll see that the leaves aren't paired, which is pretty common in many other flowers, is that you'll have one leaf on one side and another leaf on the other side, and maybe that sort of ratchets its way up the stem. And then there are other flowering plants that make like a little cluster of leaves and a little fan of leaves, and then it'll go a little while up on the stem and make another little fan of leaves. Well, ancient angiosperms had a spiral pattern, so they kind of worked their way up the stem in a spiral, and that is a characteristic of a more ancient body plan for angiosperms. So they have spirally arranged leaves, and then also spirally arranged floral patterns, kind of a whorl that makes the pattern of the tepals. And then also in the fruiting body of the plant inside the tepals makes a conical shape. So kind of like a gymnosperm, right? Like the pine cones of a gymnosperm. It's also sort of a conical spiral shape in the seed part of magnolias, and that's another unique characteristic of the ancient lineage. They also have fuzzy coating on the outside of their buds, and that fuzz exists plausibly for the same reason that animals have fuzz, which is insulation from freezing temperatures. It's one of the reasons that you see magnolias blossoming earlier than many other flowers, is because they have a built-in insulation coat on their buds. All Right, so this is a picture of, this looks very much like the tree outside of my house. So they have very waxy parts. Their leaves and their tepals are very thick and waxy, and that's to protect them partially from drying out, and also protection from ultraviolet rays. So thick, very, very waxy, substantial tepals. Also protection from hungry beetles. So this is an interesting factoid about magnolias. They are not pollinated by bees, unlike nearly every other flower. When magnolias first evolved, there were no bees, right? So these things are more ancient than bees and wasps. They were instead pollinated by beetles. And when I learned this fact a few weeks ago when preparing for this talk, subsequently my magnolia tree in front of my house started blossoming. And so I went out and looked at it carefully, and lo and behold, I found these little beetles on it. Scientists weren't lying. It's amazing. I could verify it with my own eyes. It's one of the cool things about science. Somebody makes a claim, you can go see for yourself. You don't have to just take their word for it, unlike other realms of knowledge. So I found on my magnolia these tiny little beetles that look very much like this. And they were just crawling around on the tepals and crawling around on the inside. And one of the cool things about magnolias is that they don't have nectar, right? You know, when insects or birds pollinate, hummingbirds and whatnot, pollinate other flowers, they're going for the nectar, right? It's this sweet, sugar-laden fluid. And it's really kind of a bait and switch, kind of. I mean, the nectar inspires insects to come and get a free meal, but in the process, they get covered in pollen. And that's what the plants are really after, is the pollen conveyance from one plant to another. So magnolias evolved before plants evolved the capability to make nectar. And for magnolias, it's all about the pollen. And the pollen they made is edible. Some pollen gets eaten by the beetles, other pollen just sort of coats the beetle, and they move on to other flowers and other plants. And so the vector for pollination for magnolias are these little beetles. And they actually smell different than other flowers. Some primitive angiosperms were pollinated by flies and not beetles. And that's one of the reasons that some of the most primitive angiosperms, which I didn't mention previously, smell like rotting flesh. Right? You've got the corpse flower that you may have heard of. Pops up in the news occasionally. The corpse flower makes this delightful scent that is ambrosia to flies. So plants have learned to mimic or to emit smells, olfactory chemicals that attract different insects. And if you look, I had a slide about the chemistry, the difference in the olfactory scent molecules of magnolias versus other flowers, but I thought that would get a little too deep, and I'm going to leave that for Joanne and her chemistry talks. But the molecular structure of the aromatic chemicals that are associated with magnolias are just noticeably different than the aromatic chemicals from other flowers. And if you get up close with a magnolia and you give it a good sniff and don't get the beetles in your nose, they smell a little different. They're not bad. It's not like a corpse, but it is noticeably different than if you go next flower over and smell daffodils or something. So it's got a noticeably different scent. And then here's the distribution. There's about 300 species of magnolia in the world, and this is their distribution. And this is the modern distribution. One of the things you might notice are these lines right here. So there's an interesting tale to be told about this. This has moved a little northward over the past 10,000 years or so, but the line of demarcation for recent Magnolia disbursement is aligned with where the terminal glaciers were during the last ice age. So the ice age sort of scoured the land, and magnolias that might have lived further north didn't survive, even though they've spread northward again a little bit since then. So a tale of the ice age can be discerned from this kind of pattern. And it's a Science Sunday I've contemplated giving. I haven't yet written it, but I have this notion of a Science Sunday that I would like to deem footprints. And I want to talk at some point about how you can look at today's topography or ecology or distribution of different living things and infer things about the ancient world. I will give you a preview just because I think it's cool, and I'll share it with you. In New England and Appalachia, there are tree species that live down low on the low slopes of hills and in the valleys, and different tree species that live on the crowns of hills. And the explanation for that I've read is that it has to do with Native Americans and the way they cultivated the land. Nobody wants to walk up to the top of a mountain, right? Well, very few people, and those people are weird. And so the horticulture of Native American peoples had a preference for harvesting and husbanding trees on the lower slopes and in the river valleys, and they left the tops of the mountains alone. And you can actually see a different ecological habitat between the higher portions and the lower portions, even though the climate between the relatively low mountains of the Appalachians may not be substantially different, especially in the mid-Appalachian and Georgia and whatnot. So that is a footprint, a human footprint of how ancient peoples living in their lands caused differences in the expression of. You're getting ready to say something. I think so. Dave, is the portable mic on? Yes. Dave says it is.
I'm looking at the distribution, and I see lots of stuff in the New World, in the East Coast. I see lots of stuff in Asia. But what happened to all of Africa and Europe? How did that differentiation occur?
Yeah, so the question is, in case the microphone isn't working, what happened to Africa and Europe? Why don't they have magnolias? I don't have a good answer to that, other than I just don't know. I didn't find a good answer. I didn't look particularly hard for the answer, and I don't know the answer. That's probably not the answer. Okay. So why aren't there magnolias in Europe and Africa? I don't know. Maybe a prior ice age. I mean, we could speculate endlessly about maybe they were there but aren't there anymore, or maybe they never moved there. One of the interesting facts I did find is I looked at, there's these online resources where you can reconstruct the pattern of the continents in ancient times. And so I dialed it back about 120 million years ago to see what the Earth would have looked like, the continents would have looked like at a time when the magnolias first arose. I was actually trying to pursue an answer to this, thinking, aha, I bet it's because of continental drift, right? And if you look, about 100 million years ago or so, the continents had started to break apart. So the Atlantic was filling up. It was a shallow ocean. And Europe was sort of tilted. Europe and Asia were kind of tilted a little bit. But I didn't see anything that would indicate that North America and Asia, Southeast Asia, were connected, unfortunately. But North America and Scotland and North Africa were connected, contemporaneous to that kind of thing. So, Joanne, you want to make sure that the microphone, the little screen on the microphone should have an indicator that it's on. It should have, maybe you, okay. Looks like there maybe was a question or comment right behind you.
My comment on the magnolias is that, if I'm not mistaken, there's a moisture, rainfall, precipitation is a big determinant whether
Oh,
they
okay.
can exist. So I'm looking at the map that you have, looking at Asia, and I would see where the moisture kind of gives out and the temperatures get too cold for magnolias to cross over into Western Asia and into Europe, just like if they came to that area. Also, I'm looking at Australia. Australia, 100 million years ago, was much further south. It's been moving northward, and so there's probably never been an opportunity for those plants to get over. It has a very dry climate, and except along the west coast, the east coast. Yeah. And I don't see where they'd have a habitat that'd be really suitable for most magnolias. Those particular species, you have tropical species in those areas.
Yeah, these are very, I love that point. I didn't think of it, but you did, and I delight in it, that seems to correspond to some of the wetter portions of the globe there.
You see that in North America, too. You can't cross through, those plants can't cross through Texas and through the Great Plains because the moisture is limiting them to the East Coast.
All right. Thank you for that insight. Another.
So the first magnolia tree that I ever recognized as such was in Sicily. And I know that in Italy, they tended to travel to the east and bring back exotic plants. So I'm assuming your map is just the origin and not the distribution.
Yeah, where they naturally occur, right? Yeah.
This might be a little bit, excuse me, off topic, but based on these older plants, when prehistoric man and woman were around, how do they know which of these plants were edible and not? And was there like a percentage that you could eat?
I don't have an answer for that either. I am also, there are a few plants that you must cook before they're not deadly to eat, and I have no idea. I'm sure anthropologists may have speculations or good ideas about it. I'm not aware of those ideas, though, about how some of the first humans to eat those plants discovered that, oh, well, Billy died. I guess let's try boiling it. Oh, look, I don't know. I don't know how that came about. Maybe they saw, for some plants, I suspect it's because they saw animals eating them, and that was a good clue. Yeah, right.
One of the things that we have done is follow the monkeys.
Monkeys, right.
If the monkeys and the apes can eat it.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, our close relatives.
We started off as animals eating it and gradually evolved, and then we became like humans with civilizations thinking about what to eat, but we already were eating.
Yeah, many of the things you can just eat right off the ground, like melons and whatnot. But for the root, is it cassava? A couple different rooted plants that are poisonous if you don't cook them, and our simian ancestors, our hominin ancestors, couldn't have been eating those at least until fire, or maybe forest fires went through and then they found that the cooked roots were. I don't know. I have no idea. But very interesting question.
Castor beans and rapeseed are deadly.
Right, rapeseed. Right. Yep.
There's certain things that certain animals. There are things that animals can eat that people can't.
Right.
Like birds can eat certain seeds.
Right.
But humans can't.
Right.
It's toxic.
Yeah, right. Different enzymes to process different things. And there are animals who can't eat some of the foods that we eat. Chocolate can be harmful to dogs. All right, here we go. So here's some cultural relevance of magnolias. Southern symbolism. Steel Magnolias, the play and the movie. The magnolia has been long identified with southern United States antebellum culture and whatnot. And a couple of states have the magnolia as their flower. Chinese gardens. Magnolias have adorned Chinese imperial gardens since the Tang Dynasty, which was in the 7th century, so like the 600s. Symbolizing purity and nobility. It's very virtuous. Victorian floral code. Victorians were very sexually repressed, and so they were heavily into symbolism. And magnolia was a symbolic flower, conveyed dignity and a love of nature, and very Victorian-esque virtues. Medicinal use. Native Americans and also Chinese used the bark of magnolia to help treat different ailments. And in fact, scientists have identified some compounds that have calming effects. And so not without some merit did they use magnolia for a medicine. And then Japanese aesthetics. The magnolia blossoms are common in their art, and there's a formal discipline of flower arranging and flower decorating in Japan, and magnolias are and have long been a part of that kind of cultural expression. So every magnolia bloom carries a memory of dinosaurs and a promise of spring. So they date back to the time of the dinosaurs, but they're an early harbinger of spring and beauty, and yet still retain a kind of ancient identity from millions of years past. So that's what I had for today, and I open it up for questions and additional questions and discussion. Yeah, we got Joanne right here.
I just want to comment, you're supposed to be AI-generated dinosaur.
It is. Yeah, it's got the wrong kind of teeth.
It has 3 arms.
Oh, does it? Oh, that was one of the triarmatops, yeah. Yeah, it's AI generated. Yeah, the teeth are meat eater teeth. I tried to get it to make herbivorous dinosaurs, and I tried it 100 times, and it just wanted to make these scary looking meat eaters. So AI, it doesn't know dinosaurs. You know.
It does it with people too, gives them extra fingers.
Right, yeah, extra fingers and toes. Yeah. All right, any other discussion? How many of you have magnolias on your property? Next door? Good, yeah. Yeah, if you have one nearby, or you can go to a park and look at them, go look at them. Look for the tiny little beetles. Give them a sniff. Notice the spiral pattern and the fact that their seeding bodies, the fruiting bodies in them are sort of like pine cones. They're just these spiral hills, these little spiral cone-like structures. So they're different. They're different than other flowers. Appreciate them. Appreciate them for what they are, which is an ancient living fossil. And I thank you for today. Oh, what did you have a comment? Yeah, they do. They make a little fruiting bodies that then fall to the ground or may be dispersed by larger animals and not beetles. So let's see. I want to make sure and let you know that a month from now, on the 3rd Sunday of May, we're going to be doing another Science Slam. Science Slam is where we invite you, if you have some topic that you're curious about and want to investigate, or maybe you already know, ecology, psychology. We've had talks about bicycles and gyroscopes. We've had talks about burning and cooking food. We've had all kinds of different talks from all areas of science. And so if you would be interested in either exploring a topic, you'd like to share what you learn with us, or you already know something, or maybe your work or life experience or education has informed you about something that you think is worth sharing, then reply to one of our various communication methods, either Mike's emails or my email or the Meetup group, if you know meetup.com. The Prairie State Humanist has a page, and you can reply to a message there. Just let us know. And if you can't find us, you can let somebody at the church know, and they can find Mike and I to let us know that you would like to give a 10 or 15-minute talk, and we'll take an hour, hour and a half in a month to talk about interesting science that you consider fascinating aspects of the natural world. And I think that's it for today. Thank you for attending.